This video is brought to you by Squarespace.
I have once again fallen victim to a Pinterest scrolling session. Over the past couple of years, I've been working on assembling pieces for my very own gallery wall, which if you don't know what it is, it's kind of what it sounds like, an amalgamation of beautiful pieces of art all arranged together in kind of that collage format, both of art prints and also just general cool trinkets and things. I've been assembling a lot of cool pieces like this for the gallery wall in my office. Right now, I think mostly it consists of a lot of swords and weapons and things like that. And right now, I would say it's almost complete, but I am to the section where I'm filling in the little gaps and the pieces in between. And I would like to do so primarily with my own art. This is where Pinterest comes in, because something I see a lot of on gallery walls is taxidermy, mounted animal heads, that sort of thing. Something that Pinterest has been feeding me over the past couple of weeks is that, but fake and fantasy creature themed. I've seen people do this with so many different cool creatures. I've seen dragons, I've seen unicorns, I've seen creatures that I don't even know exactly what to call them, but they look cool and I would love to have them on my wall. And I feel like something like this would just be the perfect statement piece. Imagine walking into a room and boom, there's just a giant dragon head on the wall. That would of course be cool, but I can't just do the normal, expected thing. What if instead that dragon head looked like it was coming into your space through a magical portal and was also breathing fire? I think that would be cooler, so that is what I'm going to do. So I think my general plan, and you can once again blame Pinterest for this, is to take that mounted dragon head idea and combine it with another idea I saw where people were basically making it look like things are glitching into their wall through using LEDs to make it look like a portal. I basically want to see if I can find a pretty decent sized mirror to use as a base for the project, probably at a thrift store, and then sculpt the dragon onto the mirror in such a way where it looks like protruding from it, and then maybe try to put LEDs around the perimeter of the mirror and then around the outside edges of the head and limbs. And then of course also I want to add a fire breathing effect and some flaming eyes. This is what we're kind of going for if I can make it work. It's a little bit of a challenge though. I need to figure out a way to diffuse the LEDs so that they look like magical instead of like individual LEDs that you can actually see. I think if I can bring this together, it will look really, really cool. So first step in all of this, I need a mirror to put all of this stuff on, and I'm going to attempt to find one of those at the local thrift store. Shall we go on a little quest?
Once I was there, I was unfortunately not having the best luck finding a mirror. The aisle that mirrors are usually in at this thrift store didn't have many options, and the ones it had were really, really small. So I walked over to the area where they keep the really, really huge mirrors and gallery art, hoping that I would luck out, and thankfully I was presented with two pretty decent options. They had a circular plain mirror and a blue one, and I ended up getting the blue one.
Okay, mirror acquired. It's not exactly what I had in mind, but I do have some tricks up my sleeve so that I can customize it a little bit and get a little bit closer. But for now, we gotta get home and get sculpting.
So now that Thrifting Kira has presumably found a usable mirror for us, I need to begin the sculpting process by working on an armature base. And I'm going to try to do a lot of the heavy lifting with this sculpture with the armature base itself, because this is something that's going to be going on my wall and I don't need to have pounds and pounds of polymer clay layered onto it, making it too heavy. So I'm going to try my best to carve out like the general form and the main shapes that I want, just with mostly wire and aluminum foil and masking tape. And then hopefully I can add very thin layers of clay on top of that. Let's get started. Also, as a reminder, after this project is done, I'm going to be posting detailed photos of it in my dedicated sculpting gallery on my portfolio site, which is powered by this video sponsor, Squarespace. I love having an actual portfolio site to post my work on. It means that I can show my work in way more detail than I can on the usual social medias, and thanks to Squarespace's easy drag and drop website builder fluid engine, I can present my work to my audience exactly how I want to and with my branding. The process of setting up your own Squarespace site is very, very simple. You can begin by choosing a flexible website template that suits your general direction, and then you can customize all the things that make your branding feel like you, like colors, text, and pretty visual assets. And you can also easily build whatever pages you could possibly want to support your website. For me, that usually means dedicated portfolios for my different art niches and character profiles. And thanks to tools like automatic image scaling, I can easily keep adding new work to those galleries with the click of a button, and Squarespace will keep them arranged nicely for me. But they don't just have portfolio or site building tools, they have virtually every tool that you would need to run your very own website. Like SEO tools so your site shows up in search results to your relevant audience, analytics for every corner of your site so you know what's working with your viewers and what can use tweaks, and an e-commerce platform that supports sellers of all kinds, whether you sell physical goods, services, members-only content, or if you're on the busier side like me but you still want to sell merch. Squarespace even has a custom merch feature through a print-on-demand service that will handle inventory, production, and shipping for you. So if you're in the market for your very own website or portfolio, you can head to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch your site, head to squarespace.com/pricklyalpaca to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thank you so much as always to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to it. Okay, I am pretty much done with my armature at this point, at least as done as I can be, because a little bit of behind the scenes spoiler stuff. Thrifting Kira at this point has not yet thrifted the mirror that I need to put all of this on, so this is literally as much as I can do at this point. So I have a couple of challenges going into sculpting onto the actual dragon head. The first one is just weight and trying not to make this thing entirely too bulky, because like I said, it is going on a mirror on my wall. I can't do it this time. I do it every time. I make everything way too bulky and way too big. Not this time. You gotta keep it light, which is why I have tried to bulk out the armature as much as possible. I've also done it in such a way where it is hollow. That is mainly so that I can thread my LEDs down through the mount and then also have like a little nook to hide them in down here. Check that out. So hopefully, the way I did this will alleviate some of the possible weight that is going into this. Also, another tool at my disposal to try to make this clay as thin as possible. Pasta machine. This one is actually for clay, but I'm gonna try to roll out my clay as thin as I possibly can and just layer it, work in the details from there. The second challenge that I face while sculpting this guy is that honestly, my dudes, I am just not all that good at sculpting or understanding dragon anatomy. Reptiles, lizards, amphibians, they elude me. I look at them and I'm like, see no form or structure, I just see blobs, snaky, noodly little guys. I actually do have a dragon that I sculpted behind me here, which actually didn't turn out too bad. But, you know, in saying that, it did take me absolutely forever to get this the way I wanted it, and I also kind of broke the sculpture like 3 times along the way. So basically, I'm going to attempt to learn from my past mistakes and improve my dragon sculpting in this video by using a bunch of little tutorials and things that I have assembled on Pinterest, because they all look so juicy and hyper detailed and beautiful. They just make my brain happy. I'm really excited to get started on this little fella and start making him look like something other than an electric eel. Rah.
First step of this whole process is covering the entire armature in a thin layer of my rolled out clay sheets. Since the face is of course the most important region of this build, as I go I'm beginning to add a little bit of detail here and there, mostly rolled out clay noodles to begin indicating important forms like a more pronounced brow bone, deepening the eye sockets a little bit, and building up the tip of his little dragon snoot. From here I'm continuing to bulk out the figure even more, mostly focusing on connecting the head to the neck in a more organic way with some thick clay worms that extend down the center of his back, and I'm also doing this at other points where I think my dragon might have muscles and tendons connecting, like following the crest of his horns or connecting from the edge of his jaw down his neck. Dragon anatomy is completely fake, so I'm mostly adding bits of flesh where it looks good, and I'm taking a lot of liberties with the anatomical details. And while I'm doing this, I'm very roughly blending out these bits of flesh to begin with, no need to smooth them out just yet. And speaking of flesh, I was almost out of my medium gray Sculpey clay at this point, so I began adding thin layers to the bottom of my sculpture with this flesh-colored clay, which either looks like raw chicken breast or a naked cat, depending on who you ask. I'm following the exact same steps on the dragon's underbelly, adding muscular worms of clay and then roughly blending them out, and after adding a little bit of definition to the jaw and bulking out the horns with some aluminum foil, this is what my dragon was looking like by the end of the first night. He was looking real unfortunate without any teeth yet, and so far we are not beating the allegations. At this point, the executive producer also scolded me for not buying enough clay for this project, so during my mirror excursion, I also acquired 2 more blocks. The next day, I was back to bulking out my fella. I rolled out a good bit of clay worms and started adding in slightly more detail to the face area, added a bit more bulk to the ridges of his snoot and brow. I began bulking out his cheeks under his eye sockets and started adding some more defined ridges extending down his neck and underbelly, and started defining the ridge on the top of his head a bit more. I also started working more on the mouth region by adding a base layer of clay to the inside and a healthy amount of clay around the corners of the jaw to make it look stronger and make the jaw itself hinge deeper. This is also when I started blending and smoothing my clay a lot more with a little bit of oil of infant, which allowed me to begin adding a lot more detail and definition everywhere. I added a lot more musculature to the face and jaw area, I added more depth and layers of flesh around the brow and eye sockets, and began connecting the horns more to the brow line. I also defined the snoot area a lot more and added significantly more depth and bulk to the edges of the mouth and jaw. I was really trying to emphasize how wide the jaw can hinge open here, so I'm extending the corner of the mouth past the main set of horns and adding a ton of bulk to the lower jaw. I finished up this initial detail phase of sculpting by adding a similar amount of definition and smoothing to the back ridges, down the side of the neck, and on the underbelly. And here I also added and smoothed out an extra layer of clay in some places to ensure there weren't any thin layers that could easily crack during baking. Now it was finally time to do something I almost forgot to do, hollow out a cavity in the eye socket so I could put LEDs in those later on. I did this by giving my dragon a slight lobotomy with my awl and stabbing 2 holes in the upper palate of the mouth that extend to the eye socket so I can thread LEDs in there after baking. I was then able to take some clear dragon eye sized mosaic stones that I had on hand and gently nudge them into each eye socket, and then build up some worms of clay around each of them to form some eyelids. Once I deepened the nostrils with my sculpting tool and smoothed out the whole face with some oil of infant, my dragon was still missing an entire set of teeth and some horns. So I began sculpting a bunch of teeth and horns in various sizes by just rolling out some sharp cones of clay and curving the shape a little bit for both varieties. I also added tiny little grooves and scratches in the horn pieces to distinguish them from the teeth, and for the teeth pieces I also added a little bit more size and shape variety by sculpting my best guess at dragon canines, incisors, premolars, and molars, with creative liberties taken here and there. Once I had a whole collection of horns and teeth, they were off to the oven for initial bake, so I don't have to worry about messing them up whenever I add them to my dragon. While those were baking away, I had to do something about my dragon's other missing limbs. So I grabbed my little hand armatures and started with the usual steps of covering both in a healthy layer of processed meat, and once they were sufficiently covered, I began adding a few clay worms to the top of the paws, connecting to the rest of the legs to serve as tendons, and began bulking those out and blending them in with more layers of clay and baby oil. And once that flesh was pretty well blended and the tendons and muscles were looking exaggerated and reptilian, I took some sharp claws I had made off camera and started attaching them to the toe beans. For these feet, I was going for a look that was slightly reptilian and slightly canine, and I think adding these claws as well as some nail beds really did the trick. As a final dragon-y touch, I added a couple of horns extending down the tops of both feet before moving on to the tail. The tail was a little tricky since I was almost out of my preferred clay at this point, but I sculpted a bunch of furry-looking tips by rolling out a bunch of pointed worms of clay and stacking them together to create tufts of fur. And as a base for the rest of the tail, I wrapped my aluminum armature in a layer of my much softer Sculpey 3 before letting it sit overnight so it releases a little moisture before I begin carving in my detail.
15 minutes later.
And in the meantime, my claws and horns were now done in the oven and ready to be applied to my sculpture. all those applied, it's time to get into the final detailing stage. For this, I'm using a variety of little tools to add the impression of scales and other surface textures. Starting off with the tail, now that the clay is taking detail a little bit better, I used a leaf-shaped sculpting tool to carve a scaly texture into the underside of the whole tail, and also carve a few more hair impressions into the tip of the tail. I then rolled out some really thin pieces of clay and started cutting them out into triangular scale pieces to use as plate scales that extend down the entire top of the tail. I then blended those plates in and textured them a bit, which looks like this, and I gave the exact same fur and scale treatment to both of the front legs, texturing the underside with my leaf-shaped sculpting tool, adding plate scales down the top of the longer leg, and finally I added a bunch of tiny scale details to the fingers with this tiny leather beveler that's pretty good at mimicking small scales. Once my dragon legs were looking fully textured, I moved on to the most intimidating part of the detail process, the head, which got the same treatment of texturing and detailing with my little sculpting tools, and it took absolutely forever. When he was done, my dragon was looking positively majestic, and with all that lengthy sculpting out of the way, it's finally time to bake all of the individual pieces.
Minutes later.
Okay, now that my sculpture is all baked and ready to go, I need to redirect my attention a little bit to the mirror because it is not exactly what I need it to be for this project at this point. You might be wondering why I got this mirror at the thrift store instead of the circular mirror that was there, because obviously a circular mirror might work a little bit better for a portal design. There's two very good reasons for that. Number one, that mirror was way heavier than this one, and knowing myself, I'm gonna add way too much weight to this as it is. Second of all, the mounting gear on the back of it was just not great. Again, just a little bit too minimal for the weight of that mirror. So this one, while it's not perfect, not the perfect shape, not the perfect color, it's about the right size and weight, and this should hang on my wall a lot better. It's actually got a wire on the back here, so that is the method to my madness there. A couple of things that I want to do to this mirror to make it actually work for this project. Number one, I want to change the frame around the mirror a good bit. I think I'm going to do this by using my usual hot glue and silicone filigree molds method. I have already been making a couple of these as I work just because I'm probably going to need a lot of them to actually cover the perimeter of this mirror. And I think I'm going to try to do this in such a way where I glue them on in more of an oval pattern to change the shape of the frame to match my design a little bit more. And then to actually mount my dragon on this mirror, I have a bit of a convoluted idea. I have no idea if it's going to work. I want to be able to take the actual dragon head on and off so that I can actually access the battery pack that's going to be inside that hollow part on it. So I want to devise some kind of thing to allow me to do that right now. Plan A. Currently, I do not have a plan B. I have this scrap of PVC pipe, and I'm going to try to mount this onto the center of the mirror so that it kind of creates a rod sticking out at a slant. And then I'm gonna try to adhere this to the mirror, probably a little hot glue, and maybe put some Warmbla around the base to stabilize it. And then finally, really get it snug on there with a bunch of UV resin. I feel like this is gonna create a pretty strong hold as long as I can cure it in enough layers. And again, no idea if this is going to work. I also don't have the best day for UV resin because it is overcast, but I'm gonna give it a shot. And if it doesn't work, I'm gonna have to figure out something else. So I have decided to pivot away from my PVC idea a little bit in favor of a cardboard tube that I had lying around. I just cut off a little bit of this because this thing is incredibly solid.
This cardboard tube also passed a weight test with my dragon head, so this idea was seeming pretty promising.
I figured out to go on there correctly, it basically needs to just sit parallel. So first I am literally just going to put it on there with a little bit of hot glue. Honestly, a lot of bit of hot glue. I am just going to do this first. first, just to get it kind of generally secured on there. But now I am going to do a bunch of layers of UV resin on top of this to secure it in place.
Along with adding 4 or 5 layers of UV resin to secure the tube, I also added a watery ripple effect on the surface of the mirror. I figured I might get dribbles of resin on the surface of the mirror anyways, and I think this is really going to enhance the portal effect later on once I add all of my LEDs.
Alright, so I have mounted this on with a lot of UV resin and a little bit of hot glue. It seems to me that it's holding pretty well, because I can do this, and this mirror is not particularly light either. Now, moment of truth, I'm going to see if this actually supports the weight of my dragon head. I'm going to be extremely careful, not taking any chances with my sculpture here. Well, would you look at that? An idea of mine is so stupid, but then it actually works. Oh yeah, we did it, guys. So now that I know my stupid idea actually worked, take all the hot glue silicone pieces that I've already made and glue them around the perimeter of my mirror.
My filigree pieces were attached, I used my heat gun truck to get rid of all those little hot glue strings, and then I masked off the entire face of the mirror and gave all of my filigree pieces a healthy coat of a golden metallic spray paint. When that was dry, I gave my filigree pieces a couple different coats of some dark washes to make it look a little bit more aged and antique. And after a very satisfying masking tape peel, my mirror upgrades are now all done, which means it's time for my dragon to get a nice coat of paint.
It is now time for my favorite part of the entire process, which is painting. I have pretty ambitious ideas for the paint job here. After a little bit of deliberation, I thought about doing some other colors, but I think I am just going to stick to the red that was on the original design that I did. But I really want to go in with all of the shadows and the depth of the color, and then do a lot of highlighting and airbrushing, kind of trying to emulate this style of painting. I've been getting fed so many of these videos on Pinterest of people just doing absolutely crazy detailed paint jobs, and I gotta have it. I gotta learn how to do this. And I think a super detailed dragon guy like this is pretty much the perfect opportunity to try to practice some of those techniques, especially on some of the scales and the horns and things like that. It's got so much texture. This guy is just asking for it.
I began the painting process by giving all of my pieces a healthy coat of a rich crimson color, focusing mostly on any raised scaly edges, leaving smooth spots on the back and stomach blank for now. I repeated those steps on the front legs and tail, and then I went back in with the dark burgundy color, this time going over the peak of any ridges and sharp edges, making them darker and more saturated. I also started darkening some areas like the corner of the mouth, beds of the horns, eye sockets, and nostrils, and when the entire dragon head and neck had sufficient layers of crimson and burgundy, I went about darkening the inside of the mouth with the same color. Next, I whipped up a warm tannish yellow color and started airbrushing all over the areas I left unpainted on my initial pass. This just helps the colors to be more saturated and vibrant since they're just sitting on top of a more neutral gray base. I colored all the gray unpainted areas of the head, tail, and legs this color, and also began introducing it to the dragon's back, horns, and face to give him more of a prominent secondary color in his color scheme. Next, I grabbed the most vibrant red I had and began spraying in between the darker burgundy and the lighter tan to create more of a saturated gradient. I tried to have a light touch with this pass so the color mixing would create more of an orange on top of the tan and a super vibrant red everywhere else. Once I had blended the entire paint job together with that bright red pass, it was time to get into the super detailed hand painting part of the process. First, First, I needed to give my dragon's tongue a nice thick coat of a deep pink color, which was followed by giving his gums a few coats of the same shade. I then darkened the beds of all of his horns with a deep gray color that had some blue undertones, and also gave some of his scales a dark wash while I was at it. Finally, I painted all of his teeth a yellowish ivory color. I painted all of his horns a bright tan and added some even brighter tan highlights on top of that. The horns and claws on the legs got a similar treatment, this time with more of a tan wash. I added similar highlights to all the scales on the legs and tail, before eventually giving the entire dragon head a final pass of highlights and dry brushing on the scales, the beds of the horns, and the mouth area. I painted some bright highlights onto the leg horns and to the top of the claws, and then added a few more shadows to all of that to blend it in with my airbrush. The very last step of the paint job was adding a little bit of an eye detail, which was tricky since I wanted those to remain mostly translucent so the glow would show through. So I ended up keeping it really simple with a thin gloss of a yellow paint followed by a thin reptilian iris, and I probably could have made the eyes look better honestly, but this worked okay for the purposes of this project, and the eye glow effect in general ended up being more of a struggle on this than I had hoped, so it kind of is what it is.
And after only about 5 or 6 hours of painting, I'm done with my dragon. I really love how it came out. I am absolutely thrilled with the paint job. The layering, everything really came together super nicely. I probably would have made it even more detailed than I did, but I also am under a deadline here, so I decided to forgo some of that for the sake of practicality and not losing my mind. But look at my fella! He looks so cool! Not at all like an electric eel like he was looking like at the beginning of this process. I'm really glad that it came together and it looks really good. So now, final thing I have to do is stick all this onto my mirror, and along with that, I have to figure out how to rig all of the LEDs, which I already have tried to put LEDs up into the eye socket area. It was a little trickier than I was hoping it would be, so that's gonna be a little bit of a thing that I have to figure out. So this is the lighting setup that we're working with here. I have one set of smaller LEDs, basically just a little orange color. Unfortunately, these are not the brightest LEDs, but they could maybe work. And then I also bought specifically for this project these guys, which are the blue LEDs that I'm going to be using for the portal. This is pretty straightforward. The LEDs that I'll probably try and use for inside the mouth, definitely less so just because of how dim they kind of are. I've already tried to get these up inside of the little cavity that I carved out so that I can use them as the eye glow. Definitely already proved to be pretty difficult, but I think that I'm just gonna give it another shot, see if I can actually get them in there. Okay, that wasn't too difficult. I don't know how well you can see in this lighting, but I did get the LEDs in the mouth, also into the eyeball holes. Still pretty dim, but at least for now, this is what I'm working with because it's what I have. So now let's go figure out these. So for these other ones, I am just gonna install them with my trusty hot glue. As usual. I'm hoping that hot glue will help these blend in a little bit and diffuse them. We'll see. I might have to have a couple of other tricks up my sleeve to really make these pop. Make sure the individual LEDs aren't super visible. That's what I'm mainly concerned about. And the executive producer is also here overseeing the final leg of the project, which is always very appreciated. What do you think? Are you happy with the result so far? Thank you. That was very encouraging. I'm kind of not entirely sure if I should do LEDs first or if I should do these guys first. Might just give that a shot real quick.
I ended up gluing the legs and tail to the mirror first after all, that way I had more of a guide for where all of the LEDs are going to go. And once those were secured in place, I began the very strategic process of trying to glue my LEDs onto the mirror. I knew that to make this look how my illustration looks, they would need to wrap around each of the limbs and then also around the entire perimeter of the mirror. So in order to do this in one long stretch of LEDs, I had to be pretty crafty about how I threaded everything. So I started them in the middle and looped those around about twice, and then wrapped them around the right leg and then the left leg, and then threaded those down and around the right side of the mirror, and then the top around to the tail, and then somehow I managed to thread them in such a way so that they met perfectly back at that left leg. I made sure to use a pretty thick layer of glue on all of these as to diffuse the light from the individual LEDs as much as possible. In the end, this effect was looking pretty good, although unfortunately I sort of overestimated the size of my dragon head. I don't know why, I just didn't measure it. It was pretty late at this point, that is my only excuse. The next day, once I actually had some sun, I busted out the UV resin once again, and I gave a healthy layer of UV resin to anywhere that I wanted to look a little bit wet or just generally have a glossy texture. The dragon itself, I added a layer to the teeth and mouth, and then to every single one of the individual horns. I also added a layer of this over each eye, which greatly improved my lackluster paint job there. And while my dragon head was curing, I also wanted to add a little bit more UV resin to my mirror. I was hoping that maybe putting a couple of layers of this over the hot glue would help it blend into the rest of the mirror a little bit more. Maybe make it a little shinier and less opaque, and this was obviously a shot in the dark, and so it didn't exactly work. The hot glue was looking just as opaque as it ever had, but I do think the blending improved the overall texture a little bit. I think for this individual project, there was just no getting around using hot glue to secure the LEDs here. But after a final UV cure in the sun for my mirror, my entire dragon project is done, and it is time for the reveal. Hello, and welcome to the end of the video. I had such a fun time working on this project. This has kind of been in my brain since a couple of weeks ago whenever I stumbled across these on Pinterest, and I just had to make one, as so often happens whenever I see someone else doing something on Pinterest. But I'm really happy with how it came out. Like, the sculpting process really gave me a lot of practice and experience doing some things that I had wanted to work on for a while now. Is it as detailed as I maybe would have liked it to be? No, because I had to be a little bit more realistic with the timeline of this project, but I'm still really happy with it, and I can just work on moving in that direction more in the future. I do have a couple of minor complaints about how it turned out and just like self-critiques. For the most part, I'm really happy with all of the sculpting itself. Like, the dragon itself I think turned out great. The main complaints I have are really with the installation of the LEDs and how they look overall. First of all, of course, the eye glow and the fire effect in the back of the throat did not really work just because the LEDs that I had on hand were really dim. They're just not really showing through. They're not showing through in this light on camera or even in darker light, really. But I didn't glue them in or anything, so hopefully in the future I can just go in, replace them with some brighter LEDs. Hopefully it'll show through. That's something that I hope to improve on in the future. As for the installation of these themselves and the overall effect, I do think that it like translates pretty well from my illustration to actually real life, but it's not exactly what I was hoping for, only just because since I used hot glue to install these, the line where the LEDs are is just like really opaque and visible. It does help to diffuse the LEDs themselves so that you're not seeing so many individual ones, especially in low light, but overall it's just like not exactly what I was hoping for, but I think it still works. I couldn't figure out another better way to do this, but
It's fine. I'm still really, really happy with it. I cannot wait to put this on my wall. Anyways, that was very long-winded, but if you enjoyed this week's shenanigans, I do have a couple of other similar sculpting videos, kind of like this. Here's a playlist. I will have it linked down below. And you should also maybe subscribe, like, and leave a comment so that a mysterious dragon doesn't come through one of your mirrors and breathe fire at you. I don't know. Anyways, thank you so much for watching, especially if you watched till the end of the video, but as always, the biggest thank you for this video and every single one of my videos goes to my patrons, and especially my very hot, fiery executive producers.
Jazz the Bat, Mushroom Sita, Ghastly, Miss Ivy Mayhem, Galaxy Stardust 035, Luxabar, My Name is A, Miss Fenris, Becca, Niloid Nom, Cyrus Orion, Jenny Craftsma, I Do TKD, Ren, Band Off the Yellow, Cloud Max, Velly Smelly, Stabby Horse, Heebie Jeebies, Cardia X, Christina Kim Tia Art, Mossy Raven, Silver, Where Do You Send a Bad Rainbow, I'm not saying that name on the internet, ABW Makes, Icegavan, A Wendu, Liana, Ermler Jean, Brian, Phoenix, PNG Not Found, Freedom and Gus Gus, Dodo, Zyle S, Agent Sketchy, Thea Maia, Lovisa, Eloquent Silence, Hypnos, Katie, Sweet Winter Garden, Gravity Drop, I Hang Out with Cats at Parties, and Bean the Bread.
Okay, check out this worm I found. Look at that little guy. Damn. Wow. Who's your good baby? Who's your good baby?